We are so blessed and honored and proud and appreciative to be here with you on Juneteenth 2023. This is our third annual Juneteenth Freedom Summit, and I'm going to start by introducing myself and also giving thanks to so many different groups of people who really made this possible. It's such a blessing to see all of you here today. Austin is experiencing a heat wave. In America, politically, we're experiencing a heat wave in so many different ways, and all of us are looking for relief. We are looking for sanctuary. We are looking for healing. We are looking for love and justice. We still are in search of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, even when we live in places that want to ban the words justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? So all of you are here today for very, very specific reasons. I'm very, very grateful for such a courageous turnout in these times. My name is Peniel Joseph. And I am a professor of public affairs and history here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm honored to be the holder of the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Ethics and Values. Barbara Jordan is, for my money, really the most important and most morally centered Texan that we've ever had in the existence of this state of Texas. And it is her example, the example of Barbara Jordan, who wanted justice, she wanted fairness, she wanted equity. She refused to scapegoat anybody, whether they were Republicans, Democrats, rich, poor, black, white, Latinx, queer, straight, undocumented. She refused to scapegoat anybody. And she really called us towards a morally centered America where we could build that beloved community, not by marginalizing and scapegoating people who look different from us, people who are different religions, people who we felt were less than us, but by actually bringing us all together to build that beloved community, irrespective of race, irrespective of economic status, irrespective of religion and citizenship status. So in so many ways, it's her legacy that we all acknowledge today on this huge celebration of Juneteenth. The Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School for Public Affairs is a center whose mission is to promote engaged research and scholarship focused on the ways issues of race, democracy, and public policy impact the lives of global citizens. Through interdisciplinary scholarship, technological innovation, and public symposia, the center seeks to develop an interactive model of history that fosters a robust intellectual and civic dialogue on race relations, civil rights, law, international relations, and democracy at UT Austin and within the wider national political and policy landscape. More than that, what we seek to do is really provoke and ask profound questions related to the relationship between race, democracy, policy, and history in the United States and globally. And we're living in an era where we need to ask these questions more urgently than ever. As somebody who studies the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., these are the times that Dr. King called for the fierce urgency of now, 60 years ago. He talked about the fierce urgency of now. And what Dr. King meant by the fierce urgency of now was the need in our public dialogue, in our civil discourse, in our secular politics, but also in our religious and sectarian politics, to center humanity, to center justice, to center love in our policies, in our legislation, but also in our civic and political discourse. And in so many ways, Juneteenth is about that. I want to give thanks to those who helped us organize this summit. Thanks to the Dean of the LBJ School, J.R. DeShazo, who's right here. Want to acknowledge Dean DeShazo for being such a strong supporter of what we're trying to do here at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. I want to thank the two of multiple partners that we have that are here with us today. Rosa Rebellion and Virginia Cumberbatch. Virginia, please stand. Rosa Rebellion, Virginia Cumberbatch. Virginia is a proud LBJ School grad, and she's somebody who's influencing so many different discourses around racial justice and healing and feminism and entrepreneurship in so many critical ways. I want to thank the Emancipator and Amber Payne, who's right here, the publisher of the Emancipator. And the Emancipator is growing out of the 2020 racial and political reckoning, and my friend Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and a partnership with the Boston Globe and now Boston University and the Emancipator. And that is really, and Amber's going to talk about this later, but really evoking the liberatory newspaper and journalistic practices coming out of the 18th and 19th century abolitionist movements and updating them for the 21st century. I want to thank the LBJ communications team, who always do such a fantastic job of spreading our message and supporting us on social media. I want to thank Shantae Thompson, the CSRD's Senior Program Administrator, for really doing so much 24/7 to make this and all the programming that we have possible. Thank you, Shantae. I don't know if Shantae is here. And our first panel is going to be a panel documenting our untold stories, the power of narrative. We have 3 different panels. Panel 2 is going to be disrupting systems not built for us. And finally, the third panel is determining a liberated future. And what we're trying to do with these discussions, especially at this specific time in American history and in the history of the state of Texas, is think about Juneteenth as a portal to discuss freedom beyond emancipation. And I'm going to say that again. When people are going to say, well, what are the lessons, what are the takeaways that we want from this conversation this afternoon? It's this idea of freedom beyond emancipation. And what do I mean by that? And how does that connect to public policy? How does that connect to higher education? How does that connect to democracy? Well, a freedom beyond emancipation is what inspires Juneteenth. Because when Major General Gordon Granger, as Yaqui Smith will school us on, came to the port of Galveston on June 17th, 1865, with 2,000 Union soldiers, he came to try to enforce a freedom that was already Black people's. And I'm going to say that again. He came to enforce a freedom that Black people already had, in the sense that they were human beings with actual dignity, and what they were looking for was citizenship, which is the external recognition of the God-given dignity we all already have. So when we think about Juneteenth and this idea of freedom beyond emancipation, what we're talking about is a freedom that, yes, is going to be legislated. Yes, we're going to get policy. Yes, we're going to get laws, but we have to recognize we inherently already have these freedoms. And the reason why we celebrate the ancestors who paved a way out of no way in Galveston, in Austin, in Houston, we think about Emancipation Park and the 10 acres that were purchased in 1872 by the 4 pillars and the different Black women and men and children who were connected to that. In so many different parts of Texas and the United States, people made a way out of no way by embracing multiracial democracy for the first time. So when we think about this idea of freedom beyond emancipation, what we're saying is a freedom that goes beyond just the external recognition of citizenship. Because the only way we can actually achieve true freedom is by recognizing whether somebody has a passport, whether somebody has a piece of paper that is acknowledging their humanity. Every single person on the planet and in the state of Texas and in the city of Austin, at the University of Texas, has God-given dignity, and with that God-given dignity comes certain inalienable rights, no matter what a judge or a legislator or somebody who's high in power might say. That's the only way. Either we all have freedom or none of us have freedom. All right, that's just the introduction. So now we're gonna Now we're going to introduce our first three panelists, Amber Payne, Funmi Ogunro, and my friend Yaki Smith. Amber Payne is publisher, and as I introduce you, please take a seat. Amber Payne is publisher and general manager of the Emancipator. She was a 2021 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and I have to give Amber her props. The Nieman Fellow is the most prestigious fellowship in the world for journalists. So becoming a Nieman Fellow is not a little small thing. Amber formerly served as managing editor of BET.com, leading editorial and digital video strategy, executive producer of Teen Vogue and Them, and in 2015 launched NBC Black, a section of NBCnews.com dedicated to elevating the conversation around Black identity, social issues, and culture. Amber started her career at NBC Nightly News, producing breaking news and feature stories. Next up, Funmi Ogunro. Funmi Ogunro is a Nigerian-American Lone Star, Emmy-nominated film producer and editor. Funmi was a part of the editorial team for Fat Tuesdays, an Amazon original series. Funmi recently edited an award-winning documentary titled Parker, which premiered at Sundance 2023. Funmi has over 10 years of experience in non-scripted and scripted film and television, collaborating with major companies such as Amazon, PBS, YouTube. She was awarded a National Education Telecommunications Association Award for her work on the national TV series American Graduate, funded by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and distributed on PBS. Funmi is currently developing a feature-length documentary about the history of Black freedom communities in Austin. And that is an extraordinary, extraordinary history, so I can't wait for that. And my colleague and friend, Professor Yaki Smith, who is blowing up like I thought you would. Remember, to paraphrase Biggie Smalls. Yaki Smith's films have received worldwide acclaim, screenings and winning awards at over 100 film festivals. His latest film is Juneteenth on Faith and Freedom, which is now being broadcast on over 335 PBS stations around the country. This is a profound documentary that found Yaki going to over 6 different cities in Texas and really uncovering the messier, more inspirational, deeper and grittier historical truth behind Juneteenth. And it's a film that has really captured the national imagination. I've written about the film in Texas Monthly and CNN.com. He's receiving really global acclaim for this film, and he's just getting started. So I'm really excited to have Yaki here. Some of the many laudits and plaudits, he has served as the inaugural Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Moody College of Communication, where he's currently a professor of film, and Variety magazine named him one of the best film educators in the world. Oh, they have one. Okay. Sometimes things go according to plan. Okay, so thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And you all are such wonderful creators and creatives. In terms of Juneteenth, and I'm going to just throw this out there to all of you as a panel, what aspect of Juneteenth gets your creative juices flowing? All of you are artists, but you're also educators who have messages and things you want to share with really global publics. But how can your work as artists, as amplifiers, spread a very specific story about Juneteenth? Because I think the very fact that the holiday is this is only the 3rd year, but obviously it's being celebrated for almost 160 years in Black communities, not just in Texas, but nationally. How does this inspire you, this holiday?
Well, I'll start. You know, I'm publisher of the Emancipator, The Emancipator, it's in the name, emancipation. And when we think about the Emancipator, we started to think about it in terms of emancipation from what? From misinformation, from bigotry, from hatred, from false narratives. And so that's kind of a foundation and a grounding of the Emancipator, this idea that there are these narratives that need to be corrected. There are these narratives that need to be shared. There are untold histories, and there are through lines in history that can help us, by looking back at the past, that can help us look at where we are now and how did we get here. You know, it's almost this ripple effect and this domino effect. And so I think that's where I approach it personally as a journalist, as a storyteller, and thinking about what kind of narratives. I mean, just Juneteenth itself, this idea of information being masked or hidden or the attempt to stifle growth and emancipation and freedom. And so I think we take that in our editorial approach. And one thing that we'll be able to share today is highlighting of a film from Funmi with that very topic. So I think that's what I feel like there's like a very true connection for the Emancipator to really recognize and honor Juneteenth. And in another piece that we published today, or re-amplified today, was a piece from scholar Kelly Carter Jackson, who talks about Lincoln didn't free the slaves freed themselves. And she breaks it down in a video commentary, exactly why. Evidence-based, historical, giving that history. And I think people need that history and context to really just be able to understand the present.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Amber, I love that. It's interesting because as someone who is from Texas and has always celebrated Juneteenth, the fact that it is now a federal holiday, in some ways for me, is good and bad, and I'm going to tell you why. The good thing about it is that now something that we've always known about here in Texas, something that we've always celebrated, a history that, to your point, in many ways was buried, has been exhumed, right? Yes, there have been Juneteenth celebrations across the nation for a while, but a lot of people, some people probably sitting in this room still don't really know what Juneteenth actually is, right? And we've been traveling with this film for the last few months, and I am actually still surprised at how many people don't really know the true history of Juneteenth, right? And so the fact that now we get to educate people about that, the fact that now the film can be used as a tool to really, again, exhume these histories, to start conversations about these histories, and to let everyone know that this is not just about Texas, and actually it's not just about Black people, it's about America in general, right? That's great. However, I think the reason I say it's good and bad is because there's also, for me, a co-opting of it that I think we have to be very, very careful of, right? That the moment that it becomes sort of on the national presence or in the national conversation, or becomes a part of the national conversation, then people start to take it and actually, in my opinion, pervert its meaning, right? It's not about selling T-shirts. It's not about everybody all of a sudden going to a cookout, right? And it's also not just about the celebration, because you said this earlier, if we stop at the celebration, in my opinion, we diminish what the holiday is actually about. This holiday is about resistance, right? This holiday is about people who, even though, I love that, the slaves freed themselves. I mean, there's an entire history, if and many people in this room know this, but an entire history of resistance during slavery. People running away, right? People having rebellions on plantations. People really fighting against the institution that had them bound. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. And then also understanding that we're still fighting for that absolute freedom that Gordon Granger came to the shores of Galveston to announce to the people that they actually had. And if we stop again at the celebration, which I sometimes think that we are, right, then I think we've lost the meaning of what the holiday is really about. And so my hope is that, and again, as I think about what Juneteenth means to me, it's about resistance, it's about continuing to fight, it's about remembering, right? But also looking back to know how to fight in the future, because the roadmap has already been given to us if we would really study these histories of how do we actually get the things that we need done. And so for me, that's what sort of keeps me going when I think of Juneteenth.
Thank you. Funmi.
Okay, I was making sure. So I agree and echo everything you just said, and you explained it so well. I'm from Austin, and I've been celebrating Juneteenth since I was a little kid. and my mom would do programming in East Austin. She has a nonprofit, and so every Juneteenth we were at the Carver Library celebrating Juneteenth. She had a storyteller there that would explain to us what Juneteenth meant. And I'm going to be honest, I kept getting confused each year. I was like maybe 8, 9, 10, because I was like, okay, wait, 1862. But then the general went to Galveston. So I was like a little kid, and I was just a little bit confused. I was like, wait, so were we free or not? But when I got into my teenage years, I kind of really got the idea. But when I was a little child, although I was celebrating, I didn't really know what I was celebrating. But I loved what we were doing. I loved being around family. I loved the spirit and energy. I loved being around Black folk. And I think all of that energy has inspired me as an artist. And growing up, or I didn't grow up in East Austin, which is the historic Black part of town, but my parents' businesses were there. And so celebrating Juneteenth in East Austin and just being around Black folk has inspired me as an artist and has inspired all my filmmaking. And I think some of that is one of the reasons why I'm so dedicated to telling the stories of Black people in freedom communities. And so as a filmmaker, it's just been that energy, the resistance, celebration has really just made me a better artist and just continues to inspire and motivate me every day.
Oh, that's great. One thing I want to talk about is, and ask you all about, is this idea of how should we be celebrating Juneteenth, in your minds? Because you've all raised questions which I think are true and profound about this idea of co-optation and something being taken over. Obviously, Texas had already had Juneteenth as a state holiday, but it's become a federal holiday. And it's a really complex time in 2023 because this is the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And at the same time, with the recent anti-DEI legislation that has just passed, in certain ways, we have a state that is the birthplace of Juneteenth very, very proudly, and is also on the leading edge of a political backlash against all of us really acknowledging Juneteenth and the legacies of Juneteenth, both the beautiful and the bitter parts of that legacy. So how should we celebrate this? Is it something that we should be proud of, a moment of veneration? Is it a moment of shame? Is it something that is the true Independence Day of the United States that stands alongside of July 4th, but amplifies the message of July 4th because it's actually happening for at least groups of Black people in this context? How should we celebrate it? And especially, we know we live in a country that doesn't like celebrations that seem like homework, right? People, because you talked about the cookout, right? One thing I'll say is that Stokely Carmichael, who I've studied, Kwame Ture, who was a civil rights activist in the 60s and Black Power activist, one of the things he said he learned as an organizer in New York and Mississippi and Alabama and other places, you had to give people marching orders, he said, about where to meet, what to do, but he always told them where the after party was going to be at. And he was talking about demonstrations in the 1950s and 60s. He said, once I told people where the after party at, and he said he used to tell people, I might not be at the after party because I might be arrested, but there's going to be an after party, right? And he said that was a big part of his organizing, right? And I remember reading that and saying, boy, this is not what I expected. So this is to anybody, really.
Well, I think everyone should celebrate by watching your film. I grew up in Southern Maryland, and I really didn't grow up with a patriotic, like, rah-rah, 4th of July background at all. So I like the idea of kind of claiming Juneteenth as our time, reclaiming a holiday to commemorate. I feel like the word commemorate is in there, which sounds like kind of boring, like you're just, doing homework again, like you're saying. But I think there's a reverence, is what I'm saying. Like, the cookout with some reverence. And I mean, the way that I've been celebrating this weekend, we're here, I'm in from Boston. We stopped by the Black Makers Market, bought something from some Black-owned businesses. We stopped by the Carver Museum, patron there, and, meeting people, talking to people. And then we spent some time with the Origin Studio House Collective, who to support what they're trying to build in East Austin. So I think about rebuilding community and finding a way that's about supporting our community, whether it's Black businesses or Black creatives, and that's maybe my personal feeling about it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I echo a lot of that. I think it's important to celebrate, but to your point, it's also important to do the homework, right? And I think whenever you go to the parade or the picnic, I love it. I want to eat ribs just like everybody else, right? But I also want to make sure that as you're leaving that space, or even as you're at that space, that you are learning something, that you're leaving not only with marching orders, but I'm putting a book in your hand, or I'm putting a QR code in your hand that you can scan on your phone to take you to either a Wikipedia page or to take you somewhere where you can learn more about what Juneteenth is all about. I'd also say that, and you hit on this, I think the community building part is so important. I was speaking at Buda on Saturday, and there's the Antioch Village, which was their freedmen's town, which my understanding is in jeopardy of being, I think, destroyed. They're trying to figure out how to revitalize it, but also just figure out how to keep it going. And I think the thing is, something I learned in making this doc is that there were over 500 freedmen's towns in Texas. What I would say, and I haven't visited all of them either, we should be going to these places because they in many ways reflect that resistance that even after these individuals had spent nearly 250 years in bondage, that after, right, they were emancipated, they went out and they built schools, they built churches, they educated their people, they built homes, they talked to their people about finances, they talked to their people about, again, entrepreneurship. They built whole communities. And I think we need to go to these communities because I'm one of these people who believes that when you stand in a space that had that much umph in it, that the spirits of those people can speak to you. And I think we just need to go and visit these spaces and, reverence these spaces, but also make sure that these spaces are not being torn down. Because when you tear down that kind of history, you also tear down the story of resistance that Black people have had from the beginning of time, actually. And that's what that's all about. If we can destroy that, it's just like with the anti-DEI stuff. If we can destroy that, right? If we can destroy true history, then we can make you believe certain things about yourself. And so we got to exhume this history, we got to talk about it, and we got to reverence all these individuals. And also we got to make sure our kids know about this, right? And you know this too. It's like when you teach in a university, sometimes I get students, one, who've never had a Black professor before. Two, when I start to talk about certain histories, when you talk about prison industrial complex, when you talk about all these things, they're looking at you like, what are you saying? And you realize that it's not necessarily that they've never heard about it. It's that the history or the way in which they've been told the story has been manipulated and perverted because their parents have given them a revisionist history of a lot of these things or a different narrative that isn't a true narrative. And so I want to make sure that we're disrupting this stuff in second, third, and fourth grade so that when they come to me at 18, come to you at 18, 19, that we don't have to do all that extra work because it is hard. It is taxing, especially when you feel that push against you because in many ways, you're not just trying to give them history, but in many ways, you're pushing against something that their parents have given them. And that's hard for them because you're basically telling them that some of the things that mommy and daddy told you are not necessarily true. And I'm not calling your parents a liar, but what I'm saying is that the history that they told you is not true history, and maybe they didn't know. And so I just think it's important that we get these things in schools early, we talk about these things early, so that we can, again, build up this community of revolutionaries that we do not have to, in many ways, undoctrinate, because that's what we end up having to do.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
That's a great point, education. Just this week, we had an event at Pease Park, which is near the historic Clarksville Freedom Community. And that was an event that, it was a celebration, but we also educated people on Juneteenth. And we took on that labor because this is the work that we do. But we also had fun doing it, and we shared personal stories. We talked about our films. We talked about our film, and we talked about, what is a freedom community? How many freedom communities were in Austin? What parts of town were they located? And so I think through my work, it's important for me to educate people. And then as far as celebrating Juneteenth personally, and for anyone else, I think that it's important to educate, but I also think it's important just to exist and Black people to exist and just celebrate. If you just want to celebrate Juneteenth and have fun and have a cookout, that's great. If you do want to take on the work to educate people, that's also important. And so because I throw a lot of events, I think it's important for me to educate people. But I also just like to have fun and celebrate Juneteenth. And I've been doing it since I was a little kid, and it just brings me so much joy.
Well, I'll clap for that. The final question that I have, and then I'll open it up for any audience's questions, and then we'll switch to the next panel, is really one about you. You all are engaged in creating narratives, all of you. And to me, as a historian, as somebody who's very interested in policy and the histories of how history and social movements, but also democratic institutions from above and below shape politics and society, one of the things I'm very, very convinced about is the power of stories and storytelling. Like I am convinced that that's the most important thing that we all have. And so how can Juneteenth become part of a narrative that is part of a shared American identity in terms of how we think about democracy, how we think about citizenship, how we think about dignity? And I say that on purpose, a shared American identity, because so often Black history is marginalized and siloed and thought of as an aftermath, when obviously Black history has been at the leading edge, and Black folks of democratic transformation, at least in terms of multiracial democracy, during the history of this country. But so many people are resistant to that. Right, resistant to that, and that's part of the challenges we face. So what can we do? Because right now we are living in a post-consensus America. Like we are after the civil rights consensus of the 1960s that helped produce Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, but also helped produce, truthfully, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. Because one of the biggest unspoken benefits of the civil rights movement is how many white people were helped by the civil rights movement, right? How many queer people, how many disabled people, because once you have dignity and citizenship for Black people and you expand that racial caste system, everybody gets help, right? And gets more access. So what can you all do in your work to build a story that's so compelling that Americans really from all backgrounds are going to say, I see myself in this story?
Well, it starts with telling your own story. And Black people, we are not monolithic. I'm half Jamaican. My dad is white. My grandfather is from Texas and New Mexico. And so I have my history. I have an interesting history and backstory, and it's by digging into that and digging into my own personal family stories and even some of the politics around, my father's politics and his history and how he comes to think the way he does, has helped me to maybe resolve some things personally, but also to just understand, how do I talk to you about this issue? I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen so I can try to understand you better, because the work that I'm trying to do is to show how toxic racism impacts us all. It impacts Black and white people. It devastates all communities. And so it gets to that idea that you're saying that of raising all boats, if you will, lifting all boats, and the progress and the work that we can do. So I think for me, I wish it wasn't just the Juneteenth. Like so many things, it's not just Juneteenth that we need to think about. I think about Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, which does such an excellent job in showing how these issues drag down communities. Think about it if you want to buy a house somewhere and you're thinking, well, where are the good schools and where are the resources? Now you're paying a premium to live in that area, and that all stems back to what? Redlining, race covenants, and this idea of segregating and pushing out communities, which of course, like many major cities, like Austin, has that story. So to me, it's continuing to tell those stories and dig deeper. And the story of the Freedom Towns, when I met and talked to Funmi about the work she's been doing and this film that she's been making, to me, I had never heard of that, and it was just another layer to that story about this erasing communities and erasing stories. So I love that you are from here. You want to tell that story. That's your history and on your home turf. And so it's about letting the storytellers tell their story. You know, it's not that the document, hey, we do what we do. We do a good job, but we want people to be empowered to also speak up and to share their story, or to entrust us with helping them to tell their story. So I think that's a big part of it for me, that we need to get it out of this idea that there are only certain people who can share their stories or present their stories. Because if we have more of that, we have this more reflective community and a reflective understanding of who we are.
Thank you.
I want to respond. Thank you, Amber. I want to shout out Stephanie Lang here. Raise your hand, Stephanie. You're about to see her on the big screen. You're about to see her face on the big screen, but she is my collaborator. We're producers. We're both producing the film Austin Black Freedom Communities, and we're telling our stories. Stephanie is a 7th generation Austinite, and her mom is here. Shout out, Miss Diane A. Shout out, yes. And so, with ties to Clarksville, and I'm from Austin, but my family's not from Austin. My mom is from Detroit, Michigan. Shout out Detroit. I love Detroit. And then my dad is from Nigeria, and they met actually here at UT. They both, well, my dad went to St. Edwards, my mom was at UT, but they met here, and then I have all these siblings and all that. And so I love telling Black stories. I love humanizing people. I remember I was talking to someone. I'm a film editor as well, so I get hired to edit different projects. And I remember somebody was telling me, like, do you get annoyed that producers sometimes just call you to edit, or only call you to edit Black films and Black projects? And I said, no, I see how somebody could get irritated, but I love telling Black stories. I love humanizing Black people, narrative and documentary, and that's my life's passion. And so my duty is to continue to tell Black stories in all different forms, continue to collaborate with people within my community to create great work, like Stephanie. And we're working on many different projects, and I'm excited to share what we did for the Emancipator today. So, yeah.
So to answer this question, I need to invoke the spirit of Prophet James Baldwin. And I just want to read a quote from him. And he says, an artist is a sort of emotional or spiritual historian. His role, his or her, he said his, but I'm going to say his or her, role is to make you realize the doom and glory of knowing who you are and what you are. He has to tell, because nobody else can tell, what it is like to be alive. And when I think of that, there's several things that come to mind. First, not only do we have to tell our own stories, but I think we have to own our own stories, right? And I say that because I think sometimes it's very uncomfortable to have this conversation about Juneteenth. Let me tell you why. Because on one hand, we're here to celebrate the emancipation of people, but the question becomes emancipated from what, right? And I think oftentimes we don't have that discussion enough. We got to talk about what was slavery like here in Texas? What was the horror of slavery? And then who, in fact, played a part in that, right? Who, in fact, enacted those horrors on those Black people that were on those plantations? Now, obviously, I am a descendant of those that were emancipated, but there is somebody in this room who is a descendant of those who actually had me enslaved. And I think in order for us to really move forward, we got to tell those true stories. And it's uncomfortable, but let's just talk about it. What does it mean? No, you didn't do anything to me personally. I'm not blaming you for anything, but we also can't deny that there are privileges that come with the fact that you may come from that lineage, and then there may not be privileges that I don't possess because I came from that other lineage, right? And if we can start to have that conversation, then we can actually move forward. And I say that because when I think about the types of films that I make and what I want to do as a filmmaker, is I want to tell the whole truth. Because the truth, as we know, you've heard it many times, will set us all free, right? And I think as a storyteller, it's important that you not only, have people leave the theater, they're celebrating, they feel good, but you got to challenge folks, right? You have to make people want to ask more questions. You have to make people look inside themselves and look in the mirror and say, again, what part did I play in the matter? Because if we don't do that, then we're all going to hold hands, smile, dance, eat the ribs, but nothing will ever get done after that, right? So for me, storytelling is about telling the truth so that we can all figure out what a blueprint looks like in order to move forward,
Thank you. Thank you. I think with the time that we have left, because we're going to have a musical interlude between the first and the second panels. Any questions from the audience? Any questions?
So this is a conversation that we've been having at work. And so this is a conversation that we've been having at work. And as a person not of color, how do I best advocate? While I may have some shared experiences, I can't know what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes. And so with that understanding, how do I advocate better?
I think fight alongside me, right? And what I mean by that is I think the term allyship being an ally became very popular, right? And while I respect that term, right, the other term that comes out of that is being a co-conspirator, right? And for me, that's the more powerful word, right? That's the more powerful active phrase. And what that means for me is that not only do you fight alongside me, but sometimes you may have to fight a battle that I can't fight for myself. And this is what I mean by that. And we know this. Sometimes, I was the associate dean for 3 years. There are certain rooms that I might say something in that is not received well, but my white counterpart might say the same exact thing, and actually now all of a sudden people are listening. And I think sometimes that's what we need. It's not that I need you to speak for me, but sometimes I may need to sit back and not have to be the one in the room fighting that battle, right? Because you can talk to your people in a different way than I can talk to them because they'll listen to you. And so for me, it's like, find out what my needs are. Don't speak for me, but find out how I need you to fight alongside me, fight with me, and sometimes even fight for me in rooms that I can't fight for myself. And I think, again, if we can all get on one accord with that, again, so much stuff can happen. So much progress can be made.
So how are we doing for, Shantae, how are we doing for time? Are we between now and the next panel? Last question. Last question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I had a question because I appreciate the inclusion part that you mentioned, and each person telling their lineage, their story on how they got here. My question is, are there any platforms or any on the table opportunities for both sides to come together to have those conversations and discussions? Are there any formalized, I know there are think tanks behind different issues and legislatures and what have you, but are there any actual formal opportunities for everyone to have those conversations that you know about?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking about. I think if it comes to people who are parts of political parties, there are definitely different platforms and different groups, including the No Labels group and other groups that are interested in that kind of dialogue. But then there's also sort of an intra-community dialogue with different sides within Black and Brown and other communities, where I think it's been more difficult getting people to the table in that sense, especially I think in the context of 2020 and what's happened to all of us since 2020, because people have become much more entrenched in how they feel, whether that might be on a slate of different issues connected to race, class, gender, sexuality, indigeneity, just so many different things. And it's hard to get people to speak. So I think there's multiple, but if you're talking about just the political divide, I do think that there are platforms being created.
I'll just add that you may want to think about, well, what am I interested in? Okay, I care about criminal justice or criminal legal reform or health equity or climate justice. And there are groups and there are people working to solve those, grassroots style. I mean, we have been doing something called solution circles. We did a solution circle for Black and Brown breastfeeding moms in the Boston area, and we brought them together to listen to them and to hear about what the challenges were and what they thought the solutions were. And, you know, it was mainly Black and Brown women in the room, and some of them were providers and some of them were moms, and they all left with kind of ideas as to how can I help or help my people. We want to do more of those, and you know, I think maybe that's an idea we have that pairs, you know, editorial information. You know, we did a series on Black maternal health with actual just real people together. You know, we're not running it. Y'all talk about it, and what are you really thinking and feeling? So I know we think of it as this big problem to solve, and I think of it personally as, you know, there are little aspects. They're all interconnected and they're all interwoven. It's all equity across the board. It's all this big fabric. So that may be one thing. I don't know if that exists in other forums. I know that's something that we're trying out.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Let's give a warm round of applause for this panel. So I'm going to introduce Riders Against the Storm, but are we ready for Riders Against the Storm? I just want to make sure. Yes? And I don't just mean that figuratively, literally too. Are we ready for Riders Against the Storm? Yes? Yes, okay. All right, so I want to introduce Austin's own Riders Against the Storm. Ghislaine Kidada Jean is an Afro-spiritualist storyteller, Haitian, performing artist and educator. She is also the founder of QDL Education, a platform navigating Black women through inherited racial distortion, decolonizing the Black woman's internal landscape, and ceasing her energetic hemorrhaging. I love that. Jonathan Shaka Mahone is the founder of DAWA, Diversity, Awareness, and Wellness in Action, a nonprofit that uniquely focuses on supporting BIPOC musicians, artists, creatives, social workers, integrative healing practitioners, hospitality, and service industry workers. DAWA has distributed $250,000 in unrestricted funds to these communities since its creation in 2019. His work was recognized by South by Southwest via their 2020 Dewey Weinburn Community Service Award and by Div Inc. in 2021 via their Champion of the Year Award. Together, they are the Austin-based institution and award-winning hip-hop duo Riders Against the Storm. They are also co-founders of Divine and Conjure, a production company focusing on empowering audiences through creative programming. Riders Against the Storm have performed throughout the United States, Europe, and Africa. They have performed on stage with numerous world-renowned stars. Without further ado, Riders Against the Storm.
Happy Juneteenth. Can I get the volume up a little bit here? Happy Juneteenth. Oh, that don't sound like you free. That don't sound like you free. Sound like you waiting on it. Happy Juneteenth. I guess that's what I'm talking about. You gotta put a little stank on it.
Where that at? What's that at? I'm here.
So, we're going to do a couple of songs for you all, and we're educators and we're storytellers in our own right, and it's really spectacular to celebrate Juneteenth on a national level right now, but we want to make sure that we bring it home, take it inside, and have you all feel it along with us here in the building as we just do a couple of tracks for y'all. This is Shaka. Everybody say, what's up, Shaka? My name is Key Dada. Say, what's up, Key Dada? What's up? So we're going to do our pieces a cappella for you. The first song that we're going to do is called Ghetto People, because so much of the innovative work that we love, it comes from the ghetto. We don't love to highlight the ghetto as a place of innovation. We like to leave it in the halls of academia sometimes, or leave it in the halls of, technology, etc. But some of the most, fantastic, innovative places, innovative spaces that you could find yourself. The ghetto is there. So this song is called Ghetto People. Y'all gonna help us out with it?
All right.
Thank you. All right. Y'all gonna say people. Ghetto. 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 Well, you're gonna say it like an on beat, but you don't do it. You're gonna do it.
I'm gonna need a little more energy from y'all too. All right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna need a lot more energy from y'all. All right. Y'all good?
Here we go.
Say freedom, freedom.
Freedom, freedom.
Say justice.
Justice.
Say freedom, freedom.
Freedom, freedom.
My ghetto.
People.
My hustling.
People.
My struggling.
People.
Surviving.
People.
We brilliant.
People.
Creative.
People.
Move on, yeah. We strong, yeah.
Hey.
My ghetto.
People.
My hustling.
People.
My struggling.
People.
Surviving.
People.
We brilliant.
People.
Creative.
People.
Move on, yeah. We strong, yeah. Living in the ghetto, gotta learn how to forget. Also grow faster than all of them suburban kids. Gotta deal with grudges that your family inherited. Gotta take a turntable, turn it into instrument. Gotta take a couple balls, stretch it into platinum. Something out of nothing quick on the daily hustling. Handy selling fish plates on Sundays to pay the rent. Then it's off to work on Mondays, 2 jobs at minimum wages. They raised since Reagan was in office. The Great Depression, yes, will trickle down economics. We running in the Olympics and we running for office, but still ain't got a pot to piss in. Streets full of garbage with bodies laid on concrete by couches truly heartless. Imposters with their Glocks ready to snap like lobsters. While children playing on the block and got no fear of moths in their closets. Up in their closets. Snapshots
of beats clacking to hopscotch. Hot basket weeds, Glocks having hot stops. We pass the trees like a breeze at parks and follow peace like degrees that spark Illuminati's into deep dark spots. We touch the sun with hydraulic shocks. We GATTO, doing the ghetto people. High yellow to purple people. Pushing with purpose people. Seeing the service people. Honor the earth people. Fly over hurdles people. Done with the murders people. We fly over hurdles people. We done with the murders people. Ghetto people. Hustling people. My struggling. Surviving. People. We brilliant. People. Creative. People. Move on, yeah. We strong, yeah. My ghetto. People. My hustling. People. My struggling. People. Surviving. People. We brilliant. People. Creative. People. Move on, yeah. We strong, yeah. She got 1 bag of rice and 3 cans of beans. Throw in a little salt for the seasoning. Keeping the family alive, probably no easy thing. As kids sit, watching cars roll by with shiny thing. From the window, he could dream and he could fly like Jordan with wings. In the mirror, pretending she got golden diamond ring. But all she got right now to hold a bag of onion ring. Sipping the cola slow from bottle like it was champagne. Watching the living room like Monroe cause she practicing to be the next Tyra Banks with legs that's pencil thin. Brothers laughing, hanging out the window, feeling the wind. You ain't a model Lebanese, you just an ugly thing. With your glasses, skinny legs, nappy hair, and black skin, look like an African on TV with that lady starving. Man, forget what you say. say I'm an African queen and
what?
you black like me, so why you cracking?
Okay.
We got a history that we can take pride in. The ghetto ain't a home, just where we reside in. Yo, you wildin'. A black woman where you confide in. She greets you and feast you in record time and given to Adam so he can recline in the bosom of the sweetest, reminding her hips where we were designed in, where our fathers rising. Music of the highest order got us all smiling.
My ghetto,
people,
my hustling, my struggling, surviving. We brilliant, creative, move on, yeah. We strong, yeah. My ghetto, my hustling, my struggling,
people,
surviving.
people,
we brilliant,
people,
creative,
people,
move on, yeah. We strong, yeah. So, we are Riders Against the Storm. Our name comes from a group called Sweet Honey in the Rock. Y'all some PBS listeners, y'all know Sweet Honey in the Rock. Like, oh, yes, yes. We go in a lot of spaces, a lot of people don't know who they are, so I assume y'all know that's what's up, that's what's up. They're an all-black female a cappella group. They sang freedom songs. Inspired us as young artists. They have a song called Ella's Song where they took words from Ella Baker. And part of it is we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. But later on in the song, they talk about passing the torch to the young who will run against the storm. That's us. The torch was handed to us. And it's our job to continue that. So, you know, as artists, we take our role. We don't celebrate art from politics or cooking or fashion or anything. It's all one thing. And so that quote that Yake read is really important. And sometimes in the city, artists have been used. Well, for a long time, let me say in a long time in the city, artists have been used. We've been put on the front page, but we haven't benefited from the growth and economic development that literally overwhelms at this point if you're born and raised here. There's a direct correlation between the moment in 1991 when the city declared itself the live music capital and the displacement of black people. 1991, black people were 12% of this population. Today, under 7%. We moved here 13 years ago, and the black people that we met, we often hear a lot of times, people move here, where are the black people at? We had no problem finding black people in Austin. It was almost immediate. Cedar Avenue is where we found them. A place called the Arun Center of Cultural Arts. But this conversation needs to be front page, that it's time for everyone in this room, everyone in the city to invest in the people that made this city what it is. There's no Austin without us. Who's us? That's black musicians, that's black people. There's no Austin, there's no city without us. And so I wanted to just give a shout out to Dawa. They mentioned it. Please go to the website, dawahills.org. I didn't hear a lot of noise, but we distributed over $250,000 in under 4 years to the BIPOC community of creatives in this city. This piece is called Brave. We need to be brave. We need to come up into spaces and we need to speak our truth. I won't have it, don't box me in. Black skin, strong mind, God's spirit, and a fit of leaving. The plantation, escaping, erasing the pain. I saw a man that was blind walk onto the train. Now he stood next to me, no expression on his face, just a slight head jerk as the train moved away. And I imagined how he walked in complete darkness, down to the subway from his apartment. How'd he know which way to turn, which way to go from his crib? Somebody had to teach him how to show him how to live, and I imagine all the teachers in the time that they took. Taught him how to read without touching the book. Taught him how to see, what to eat, how to cook. With no eyes, my brother on the train made me look deep into myself and all the excuses. all the self-doubts and the lame executions, all the ways I run from the things that need change, all the ways my vision plays tricks on my brain. See, they use our eyes to keep our heads to the pavement, instead of to the skies, to the heavens towards greatness. Inspiration, motivation, the basis. Without it, we blind. 2020 is wasted. The door is open, and my brother disappeared. Soaked up into the crowd like a tissue grabbing tears. I stood up and looked around, watched him slowly climb the stairs, and I wondered to myself if anybody cared. If you lost your vision, would you still think the same? Would you sit and wait for somebody else to blame? I'm not saying that life don't put boulders in your way, but do you see them as a lesson, or do you run away? I'm not gonna be a pawn. I'm not gonna be a slave. I'm not gonna be blind, and I'm not gonna behave. But I will use this voice and talent that God gave. I will stand on my own and keep the faith. I will always remember my brother on the train. He taught a lesson without speaking about how to be brave.
All right, let's give it up for Riders Against the Storm. Let's give it up. Let's give it up. That's really beautiful, and it's a beautiful message to see when we think about Black Austin and the history of Black Austin, which so often has not gotten its due. It's so great to see folks who are in here who understand that we cannot be the tech capital of the world. We cannot be the music capital of the world. We cannot be the beloved community in this great city where we have everybody here but Black people. It's important for us to understand that, right? I remember growing up in New York City, and they used to always say Burlington, Vermont, and certain cities were like the best cities to live in. And I used to ask people, why? And I found out they had all the ice cream you could eat and no Black people. So they said, these are the best cities. You go to Burlington, you get that ice cream and there's no Black people around, right? And I'm like, well, no, I mean, we need more flavor than that, right? We need more flavor than that. All right, we're gonna go to our panel 2, which now is just me and really one of my favorite people who's so inspiring, Rudy Mater. And Rudy, we're gonna sit right there. Rudy Mater, and we all know Rudy, who's such an important part of the Austin and the Texas landscape, proud Longhorn as well. The son of Haitian immigrants, Councilman Rudy Mater is of the first generation in his family to complete higher education, graduating not only from the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts with a BA, but also a master's in public affairs from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and a doctor of jurisprudence from the University of Texas School of Law, Hookum. Before joining Graves, Dougherty, Huron, and Moody, a premier litigation law firm in Central Texas, Rudy served as special counsel to the Health and Human Services Commission. Rudy is married to his amazing wife, Letitia, and the father of 3 wonderful daughters. So we had a couple other people who were going to be on this panel who could not make it, so this gives us more time to just chat.
I was like, how did you set this up? All right.
I've always wanted a one-on-one with Councilman Mater. This is about disrupting systems that weren't built for us. As somebody who has been so impactful in terms of, both as on the city council of Pflugerville, but also you've been such a impactful alum and booster for the University of Texas, but also the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the law school. Let's break that down this idea of disrupting systems that aren't built for us, especially in the context of Juneteenth. Because as somebody, I think Rudy's one of the amazing people who I've met here, and I've been in Austin for 8 years, but Rudy bleeds burnt orange. I'd say, and I've got panels, Rudy and Dr. Reddick, Rich Reddick is here too, but you talk, it's not just right there in terms of them shoes. Rudy bleeds burnt orange, right? And I think that's really important. And I want to give a shout out. We have precursors in the room too. So can folks stand up who are really some of the important first generation of African-American graduates at the University of Texas, and they bleed burnt orange too. So I want to talk to you about that, because I think one of the things I've been saying in the midst of this backlash is that when we share the story, and we had a great panel, and we just had Riders Against the Storm, and I think you embody this, which is why I want to get this out, is that the search for freedom beyond emancipation is based on a deep and profound love of America, a love for Texas by Black people who are also staunch critics of racism. They're staunch critics of racial injustice. They're staunch critics of racial terror. But this is really guided by a deep love of the country, right? And it's a love for the Reconstructionist legacy, the multiracial democracy. And even University of Texas, we were excluded in 1883 when it was founded, and we still have our Black graduates and Black folks in Austin, even as they've had a criticism of where UT has gone wrong and where they've amplified the wrong, but they've had a big, profound love of the school, and not just the sports team, but what it represents at its aspirational best. And I want us to talk about that, because I think sometimes we don't lean in enough into that story. I think Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1967, before criticizing the Vietnam War, he announces at the Riverside Church that the sermon he's about to deliver is because he loves the country, not because he hates the country. He says, I'm going to deliver this speech because I love America and I want to see America live up to its potential. So there's something deeply patriotic, there's something deeply American about that somehow gets misunderstood. And I think you exemplify that, which is why I asked the question.
Well, you're too kind, first of all, and such an easy question. I'd say this. I think that it gets lost in the discussion more often than not that we can be proud patriots, loving our country, loving our state. I mean, you know how Texans are. Wherever you go across the country, you're a Texan. You go across the world, you're a Texan, no matter what. Period, end of story. But be disgusted and concerned about our politics. Be disgusted and concerned about our policies. Be disgusted and concerned about what's going on with the leadership around us. And you brought up the precursors, and part of for me, my history, getting on campus here in 1998, being the first top 10% class, and now seeing essentially the things that happened during the Hopwood period come back on campus now. It makes you wonder, and you do an excellent job of speaking about history, Peniel, about how we give this narrative that history is something that's linear. That you just go forward, hey, listen, I got rid of slavery, I got rid of Jim Crow, Civil Rights Act, hey, we're good, right? That's just the way it is. And people want to look at it that way, and then when you complain, say, what are you talking about? Look where we come from. Hey, you're right. We have come from a long place, a place where, hey, things were much worse than were before. But we also need to be realistic about what our history is. We're talking about the precursors. We're talking about Swett v. Painter. Swett v. Painter, think about that. You're talking about 1949 right there. If we're talking about Levittown, and we're talking about how, the biggest transfer of wealth in this country that happens all the time is date of death, and it's a transfer of property. If you weren't allowed to actually have home ownership in the suburbs, which Black and brown people weren't, where are you going to transfer that wealth? Where are you going to build up that equity? And that's just as recent as the last 50 years. And so, and I love what Riders Against the Storm specifically said about the Black lands and about the University of Texas. Because it is a mixed history. It is a history where I come on campus And I do look around saying, wait a minute, where are all the black and Hispanic people? I grew up, in Texas. What's going on over here? Then I go over to the east side, and I'm told about the theft that happened of the black lands by the University of Texas. How black and brown people weren't even allowed to be on this side of 35 after dark. And how even to this day, you still have people. My wife's family goes back over, her mom's family goes back over 100 years in Bastrop County. Her dad's family goes back over 100 years in East Austin. And the stories I'm still told now, resonating from my 70-year-old father-in-law. We can't act like these things didn't happen. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, you and you have a bunch of Haitians up in here today. I don't know if y'all know about that right there as well. And we're the children of Haitian immigrants. We know very well how blessed and how lucky we are to be a part of this country. We know how easily democracy can go away. Go look up Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvaliers if you want to go in and understand how that can be. But it doesn't make it perfect. And it doesn't mean that we just have to assume what's happening now is okay. The gentleman who asked in the back, and this is, by the way, your panel, oh, man, you got some, this is what's great about programs like this. You have people like yourself, you have people in this audience who really are leaning into these issues, who are speaking truth to power, who are speaking their own stories, because as they said, the panel talked about, you have to tell your own stories. I wish we could just transfer that to people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who truly believe they love this country and they truly believe what they're saying, what they're doing is right. But they don't get to see this. They don't get to understand it. I feel like, how many times do we speak in echo chambers? What did you put it? And you were being, I was telling JR, you were being PC when you said it. A post-consensus America?
I wouldn't call that PC. I really believe it's post-consensus. And the consensus, what's so interesting is that it's a racial justice consensus that I agree with you was imperfect, right? And it's an imperfect consensus from 1963 to 2013. And I think what's extraordinary, though, about that consensus is that 50-year period is the 50-year period where more women and people of color built wealth, got degrees from places like the University of Texas, became entrepreneurs, became elected officials, including yourself, right? Became presidents of university. Think, we had black presidents of Ivy League universities before Barack Obama.
Yeah,
we had Ruth Simmons, right? That's how before you could get a black president, our proof of concept was Ruth Simmons, President Ruth Simmons of Brown University. So that 50-year consensus, as imperfect as it was, actually produced the greatest material benefit for both black people, people of color, but I'll always add, and white people. Yes. That's the whole thing. It built up wealth for them, too. That's the part that gets lost in all these discussions. I can't emphasize enough how frustrating, him and I are close friends, we talk about this all the time, is that, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we act like it's just a benefit for people of color. No, this is a huge benefit for white people, for white America, to better understand viewpoints and ideas that they're not in those circles. They don't understand. They've never lived in those shoes. And, even if you don't care about, let's say, okay, you don't care about equity, you don't care about inclusion, you don't care about those aspects, you do care about money. And there's a reason why these Fortune 100, these Fortune 50, Fortune 500 companies are so leaning so heavy in it. They understand the need and the necessity to have those different perspectives and viewpoints in the room, and how it makes better the whole entire conversation. You and I were talking beforehand about how we have some expectation, even though, to be fair, we just saw what happened with the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. That was a shock. But I don't think it's a shock that a lot of people think it is once we get out the decision on affirmative action. But real talk, affirmative action hasn't been affirmative action since Bakke. So it's already been that way for over 50 years or so, a completely different concept over here with that. And when we're having conversations about race, conscientious
a racial reckoning, Juneteenth, and how we can be very damn proud about that holiday, while at the same time understanding and speaking the truth about what led there. One of the frustrating things is that I've heard numerous times over this, particularly this last session, people say that they don't want their children to be in a place where they feel bad about themselves in the classroom because of history. I don't remember that conversation when I was one of the few black kids in the class talking about slavery, talking about lynchings, talking about all these things that happened over there. That was never discussed. And, that's in that hypocrisy. And to be fair, it's the same hypocrisy that we hear that, that they're not cognizant of as they speak, that when we talk about DEI. Rudy, I'm all for diversity. But that whole equity and inclusion thing, I don't know anything about that. People really believe that. They do not understand, how do I put it in a PC word? The inconsistency, in articulating that. And that's the stuff when you tell your truth, explain and talk about these things. Because obviously if we went around and we started yelling to people about how they're wrong, I am so proud. Talk about the precursor set the example for us. And leading now, clap for them, absolutely. For what they did on this campus and leading the charge on that is amazing. I'm just as proud to see students like Sam Jefferson and Allison Yee and what they were doing regarding this latest DEI effort, rallying all the colleges across the state to speak truth to power on those issues. We need more people to do that, to tell these stories. Obviously, if we thought that, yelling at everybody was going to get things changed, we'd be okay right now. So what needs to happen is that since we live in a, post-consensus, I'm going to call it, this is what I use, and I know there's a generation here who has no idea what I'm talking about when I say this term. We live in a choose-your-own-adventure society. And living in this choose-your-own-adventure society, for those who don't know that term, there used to be books, that you would say, well, if Randy's going to go over to the river, go to page 39. If Sally's going to go ahead and go to the store, go to page 52. That's the world we live in now. We have our silos. And if we're going to actually fix a lot of these issues, we're going to have to break out, God bless you, out of these silos and start talking to people, their different roles, things that you do, things that JR do, people like myself who we reach out. Rich does a phenomenal job of doing it, articulating to people, hey, I get where you're coming from, but let me tell you my story. Let me tell you my perspective over here as well. Because it's only going to be those interpersonal connections that are going to change things. Because right now, it truly is a world where you have two very opposing views being thought about, and we're sharing the same space, but we're not sharing the same mind.
That's great. I want to lean into that, especially we're celebrating Juneteenth today, 2023, in Texas, really right in the aftermath of, you talked about the ledge in this past session, a session where tenure was under attack, a session where DEI was successfully marginalized and has to be gotten rid of or rebranded or however in public universities. But this is also in the wake of the critical race theory hoax and K through 12 education and assaults on Black history, and especially with Texas, even different from Florida, and Florida has been at the leading edge. But Texas, this is especially hurtful. I won't even say ironic, because I don't think it's ironic. I don't think these are aberrations. These are juxtapositions. America, like Texas, has always been two things at once, simultaneously, right? So we have to understand our history. There's a duality, and there's a dueling history, D-U-E-L-I-N-G, and there's a duality to our history, D-U-A-L-I-T-Y, right? So, but it's especially hurtful that on the third anniversary, both with the Freedom Summit that we're having in person because of COVID, we had it online. But just a couple of years ago, after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it seemed like we were turning the corner 3 years ago. And it seemed like whether you were conservative, a liberal, progressive, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent. Everyone was coming to the table, it seemed, or so it seemed, to say, look, what happened to George Floyd was murder. We need to transform the criminal justice system. There needs to be some kind of bipartisan accountability at multiple levels, right? And certain states have leaned in. California is actually seriously discussing reparations. And certainly the city of Austin has leaned into it in a different way than, say, the state of Texas. But I want to talk to you about, where do we go from here, considering that this Juneteenth 2023, we're living in a state that in many ways, the political forces who are in power, not everyone in the state, not everyone in the state, but the political forces who are in power want to really obliterate the history that we study and we learn from in terms of Juneteenth. Because in so many ways, diversity, equity, and inclusion was at least one response to that history. Not the only response. People had other strategies, but that was one strategy that became mainstream. I'm old enough to remember multiculturalism. We used to call it multiculturalism in the 1980s. I'm old enough to remember that. And we went from sort of multiculturalism to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion here, JEDI. And then there's been this complete pushback in a state like Texas. So what can we do, and what can we do for those of us who are in the law, who are elected officials, but who are also really interested in higher education and leveraging higher education for the good in a way where we think that there's actually a consensus for the good, right? A consensus on what it means to be good, meaning inclusive, expansive. What can we do? Because I think this is a very odd moment in American history, and especially Texan history, because on the one hand, we've got these celebratory red, black, and green Juneteenth, and then on the other hand, you're saying, don't ever say the word diversity, don't say the word equity, don't say the word inclusion, don't say the word justice. Amanda Gorman, our black genius poet laureate, her books, Maya Angelou, so many black women, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, so many of our amazing writers are being banned in the United States of America, right? And this is the home of the free and the land of the brave.
Yeah, easy questions again. I laughed when you said I'm old enough to remember multiculturalism, because the Multicultural Information Center at UT, Brenda Burt, that was a haven for us, coming here as well. Malcolm X Lounge, just meant so much to us in so many different ways, and it's interesting to see the transformation of that there. I remember President Faulkner on campus many years ago, and having a discussion with him regarding how I felt he wasn't doing enough to protect us on campus. Meaning us, kids of color, dealing with Hopwood, dealing with Top 10% and everything else over here, and getting flyers on campus saying, don't date black men, they're going to give you AIDS, dealing with all the racist parties, ghetto parties, south of the border, Mexican party, the facing of MLK statue, all these things on campus. And really telling them, hey, listen, we're kids here just trying to learn. Like, why can't we just be like our white compatriots? We just want to get an education here. This is one of the best institutions in the world. Why aren't you doing more to protect us? And I remember the look on his face when I posed it that way. And he told me years later about how that really resonated with him when I said it that way to him. As, hey, we're just 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. What can you do to protect us over here? And I like the way you put it. Regarding, you said, what can we do? We've got to keep talking about this hypocrisy, about this binary system, that person. I mean, we didn't even mention Opal Lee's portrait is in the Senate forever over here. And then we're having this whole conversation about getting rid of DEI across the state over here. We're in a weird part of our country's history where people who should know better And many who do know better aren't doing better. And strangely enough, as the people with the power, people who elect these folks in these positions of power, we're not holding them accountable. I tell people over and over again, starting when I visit kids in kindergarten, and, in third grade, it's like, I work for you. No, you can't work for me, Mr. Matera. No, I work for you. I'm the elected official. I'm here to serve you and make your community better and, spur the difference in everything that we do. I work for you. We don't work for them, yet we act like that. We act like we're just held hostage, like, oh man, this sucks. Well, I guess we got to put up with it. No, you don't. You don't have to. And here's the irony of a lot of this stuff, a lot of this whole conversation. At the local levels, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, we all agreed. The elected people were like, this is ridiculous. I mean, you're seeing a Juneteenth celebration, Pride Fest in Round Rock, Texas, in Leander, in Georgetown, Bastrop, Utah, all these other places that you're like, whoa, okay, what is going on over here? Well, it's progress. And it's a shared value of, just like you said, I guess, Haitian, so Catholic, right? Natural law theory. You have respect because you're a person. Nothing else, nothing more, nothing else, because you're a person. Can I lose respect for you based on your action? Absolutely. But I respect you because you're a person. You have dignity and rights that go with that. And, it's always been the conversation about, Black rights, Black history isn't just Black history, isn't just Black rights. It's for all. It's always been a tide lifting up all boats. And right now, more than ever, we need people, I don't really like, as someone said, I think someone said ally, co-conspirators. We need people who are willing to go ahead and speak truth to these situations. Because, you and I have that conversation. It's different when it comes out of our mouth, as opposed to some of our white compatriots and more from there. And there are many. We're not as divided as it seems. We just aren't. Speaking to, the folks I speak to, the people I deal with, local, national, I can't tell you how frustrated I get. And this is, hey, y'all, you want to know the secret behind your legislature and all of these things? Many of those people, they don't want to vote for this stuff. And they will tell you, please try to kill this before it gets to us so we don't have to vote on it. But they're being held hostages by extremes, which in turn holds all of us hostage on these issues. We've got to get to a point where people feel empowered to understand the power they have to make true systemic change. Because we can. But right now, we're in a point where we're just like, yeah, this sucks, and I guess we got to live with it. And we've got to get people out of that mindset and understand, no, you're in charge. They're not. You set the agenda for the Texas you want. I mean, this is a Hispanic servant institution. This has been majority minority for years, the University of Texas. And people are shocked when they hear that. People are shocked that the majority minority state. Now, what happens with those values and those viewpoints and perspectives when they're doing from there? I know that I've heard the phrase that people are afraid that, which honestly, I'd never thought about until someone brought it up to me. Rudy, and this is one of my close friends, said, Rudy, I think a lot of white people are afraid what people of color will do when they're in power based on what we did to them. And I never thought about that, right? I never thought about anything else like that as well. And I will tell you that we know we don't have people thinking about that. We just want to live our lives and have the same rights they do. Yeah, nothing to worry about over here.
Nothing to be worried about. My final question, and Shantae, am I fine with time for one last question? Yes? Yes. Final question is, so Juneteenth, you've been raised in Texas. You have a favorite Juneteenth story, whether it's since it's become national holiday or even before? Any favorite, Juneteenth moment for you, for your family, whether as a kid, whether now as who you are?
think somebody had the opposite viewpoint than I did, but this is the viewpoint that I saw. The commercialization of Juneteenth has been fascinating to me. To see all this swag all over the place, et cetera, over here. Where, back in the day, no, man, we just go to the East Side, go barbecue, hang out, talk, tell the stories, Carver Museum. I think only was talking about the Carver Museum. Oh my gosh, I was just thinking about, first of all, I was like, oh man, I think I'm old enough to be her dad, which is insane. And then two, but think about how we have a generation that remembers that now, right? That understands that's how we celebrate it. But it was really a tipping point for me when I went into Walgreens and I saw a bunch of Juneteenth paraphernalia and, plates and everything else over here. And I'm just thinking, I was like, okay, so this is what happens. This is what happens when something becomes mainstream, but it needed to happen. It needed to occur. People need to know that, and I love the way we put it, this is not just a Texas story. This is an American story. It's not just a black story. It's an American story. It's our history. It's our holiday. It's our tradition. I'm hopeful because I truly believe this. Most people are good and want to see good being done. That we are at a point where we're going to push forward on a lot of this, honestly, nonsense that we're dealing with, where you have to go change whole cloth departments across the state based on a lie. That's insane. But here we are. You know what we called CRT in law school? Legal history. These things happened. These are real things. The Color of Law. If you all want a book to go ahead and read The Color of Law. It was not controversial because it was true. We talk about places like Mississippi and Alabama. No, it's true about racism in San Francisco, racism in Austin, Texas. These are real things, and we've got to tell the whole truth. Often, I keep hearing over and over again from my compatriots, we have different viewpoints, Rudy, we just want to be able to tell history. We want to be able to tell the whole history. Well, your words are different than your actions. And we've got to remind them, hey, you said this. This is what you're doing. And as people, again, we've got to realize that we're the ones in charge to tell them what they should or shouldn't be doing.
All right, I'm gonna end. Yes. We're good. Okay, yeah.
Oh.
Okay. No. So
you know who the boss is around here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of that, because you speak to so many different people from all walks of life with different perspectives. Tell me, in the context of both Juneteenth, but also your daily life, what you do, how do you think, and especially what a university like University of Texas might do, what could we do to bridge the gap and bridge these divides, right, that are existing in society, especially among people who, because I think the only way you can bridge divides are that we're all listening to each other in good faith, and we're not acting in bad faith. So in good faith, and what I mean, a great example, you talked about affirmative action. You talked about Hopwood and now Under Fire. Good faith is that we may say to ourselves, we're on opposing sides, but we want to see more racial, ethnic, gender inclusion at the University of Texas, but we have a good faith disagreement on how do we best go about that. But ultimately, we both want to see better numbers. We want to see, the precursors recognized. We want to see all of that, right? Bad faith is that I actually don't want to see a more diverse University of Texas, and I'm still trying to engage in a discussion with you, right? So how do we get a good faith discussion, especially you talked about legislators, for instance, who you say, hey, they tell you, Rudy, we kill this in committee because the extremes have set it up where to keep my position, I have to vote on this. Of course, we can have a critique of that person, but putting that aside, because I think that's also very real, right? Like where we are at in our politics, that is very real. So you might have good people who are sacrificing aspects of their principles or their integrity to keep a position, and that's sort of between them and their God. But for us who become recipients of that bargain, what can we do at the University of Texas? Because we're under such fire as a too woke institution, a too liberal institution, a too progressive institution. We're under fire as we are indoctrinators. We don't teach, look, we're talking about Juneteenth here. The indoctrination continues, just mentioning it, right? Just talking about it, even though it's really American history, right? And so what can we do? Because I think what this time has shown me more than ever, and I've been around these institutions for 33 years, is how important universities are. Just how important they are, the most, in certain ways, the most important connector to the fabric of our society, whether you live in rural or urban or wherever you live.
Hey, boy, that's a really good question. And for me, what I've seen, and I love what JR's done with the LBJ School, is that you should be able to have a place where you can have various different viewpoints and ideas debated and discussed. You need to have that. How many times you and I have had this conversation, major legislation in this country has come from, the majority of it from, if not almost all of it, divided government. That's what it is. Hey, guess what? Compromise is not a dirty word. That's real. But remember what Socrates said, though, as well. You cannot have a debate until both sides agree to the rules of the debate. And right now, we're not even remotely on the same side regarding the rules to a debate. That's fine. You can have a different viewpoint or ideas on things, and more often than not, people do. But you got to be able to understand that some things are just facts. Slavery was a real thing. The history of Juneteenth, that's a real thing. You had 250,000 slaves in Texas that didn't even know that they were free. That's insane. And that should be discussed. At the same time, we do know that people there are honest brokers, people who really want to debate in how you get about to doing things regarding diversity, right? There are people who truly think to themselves, the best way to go ahead and make everyone equal is by never mentioning race. Don't worry about anyone's socioeconomic background. It's America. You're going to pull yourself by your own bootstraps, and it is what it is. Me personally, I believe what Thurgood Marshall said. Nobody's ever pulled themselves by their own bootstraps in the world. There's always been someone lending a hand and out there from there. But people don't see, from their perspective, the not only the influence, but the legacies and the connections that have made their lives easier. First, you and I are first ones in our country. I'm the first one ever grad school, law school, et cetera. I had nobody in front of me. I didn't even understand, what was an LSAT. I was like, what is this? I got to take another test? That's insane. Then I just get done taking another one. But I had people here at this university who literally saw what I was doing saying, hey, listen, okay, I don't know about this stuff, but I can introduce you to somebody. Hey, have you thought about this? Have you talked to this person? And I've seen how that can make a demonstrative difference. People don't think about how having their college paid for gave them an advantage in where their life. Or heck, okay, let's not say you didn't have your college paid for, but let's say your mom or dad or both co-signed on your first loan for your house or for a car. They don't see those little things that made a difference, in your life, sending money to college for them to go to college. And what's good about places like UT is that, it is the flagship institution of Texas. We all, we love the Longhorns, we love our sports and everything else from there. So you have that common love. And then you use that baseline to say, hey, listen, we love our school, we love our institution. Let's talk about what's happening currently on here. Because, you're having, I guess we're having a real conversation. Let's have a real conversation. You're having an institution that's being held hostage right now, where they don't want to do what they're having to do, starting from the president's office down. Heck, starting from the chancellor's office down. but it's what's happening. And we know that's not okay. And we know that there are honest brokers on the other side who want to do it, but we also know there are people, this is exactly what they want to see. And we have the ability, to differentiate between people who are honest brokers and people who are truly just trying to go ahead and destroy institutions and things that work for. UT is in a unique place right now. The LBJ School is in a very unique place, as you've had done before, having Carl Rose speak and other people speak, to hear the other sides of that. I get frustrated when I'm in spaces like this and I don't see more, I'm going to call them out, conservatives in these spaces. Because I oftentimes hear, hey, no, we want to support, we want to hear different viewpoints and ideas. Well, where are you in these discussions? Because I know I've gone to their discussions, and I will tell y'all for a fact, their whole viewpoint of DEI, oh my God, that is it's a completely different viewpoint, but it's their truth. And as they tell me when I'm in these spaces, Rudy, we don't have people like you coming to say what you do to us in these spaces. And, we have to get back to that shared set of rules. These are real facts. These are things that actually happen. And based on these facts, how do we build along a policy that can only not just support one aspect of Texans, but lift up all Texans?
Thank you. We're going to close there. Thank you so much. Really powerful. Thank you. I've always wanted to be on a panel discussion. I got my wish. All right. Another round of applause for Rudy Mateer. Thank you. Rudy is a genuine, Longhorn gem. Okay, we're gonna show a documentary trailer, This Land is Our Land. Today we are pleased to debut This Land is Our Land, a new short film series from the Emancipator about untold histories and consequences of dispossessed and stolen land. It was developed in partnership with filmmaker Funmi Onguru, who is currently developing a feature-length doc on freedom towns. Are we 100% ready? Because if we're not, we're good? Okay. Okay, let's take a look.
We are in Clarksville at the Haskell House. Clarksville is one of at least 15 freedom communities in Austin. And freedom communities basically are settlements, they are townships, also known as freedmen's towns and colonies that were established after the Civil War until about the 1930s by freed people. So the Haskell House is really one of the last symbols of what Clarksville was at one point, right? It's this freedom colony. Now we're gonna meet a family with long ties to Clarksville.
We are the Griffins from Clarksville. This is my sisters. And
I'm Florence.
And I'm Verna Carroll.
And I'm Deborah.
I'm Rita.
My grandfather, Link Thompson, was raised in the Haskell House.
Linnell, his granddaddy. That's our mother's father.
Oh, wow.
Brother
Really?
Squire Johnson.
He looks like
And this is Mary Tutta Francis' father.
What does, looking at the Haskell House, I know it brings back certain memories and thoughts for me. What's the significance of this?
It's our bloodline. It's definitely positively our bloodline. A lot of history. With this house is how we learn what the first home looks like in Clarksville. That they all had cabin homes like this, and that's how they lived out here then. So it's really important to know.
Clarksville, as we see today, is different in many ways, even though there's work to preserve a lot of the landmarks. One of the main reasons that that's the case is because of the City of Austin Master Plan of 1928, which basically worked to segregate Austin. There was this effort to basically push these communities to what we now know, is historic East Austin. And the way they did that is by intimidation and threats and violence, and by denying resources and services like, water and flood measures and things like that. Clarksville, unlike, unfortunately, many other freedom communities in Austin, Clarksville really sustained itself even, in the midst of so many forces trying to tear the community apart. And so that really just is something really amazing, inspiring about the community, and something that I think we can all learn from.
All right, we are going to have our final panel, which is really connected to that trailer that we just saw, that very, very important trailer. Determining a Liberated Future. We'll start with Stephanie Lang, who we saw in that trailer. Stephanie Lang is a writer and community curator. Is a writer and community curator who uses the power of storytelling. First one right there. Right? Yeah, right, yeah. No, thank you. Who uses the power of storytelling, as we see in Funmi Onguru's film, to explore concepts of home, resistance, and spirituality. Currently, Stephanie is working on a book of short stories centered around Black women's community organizing in the early 1900s. After the success of her curatorial debut of the photography exhibition Seen and Unseen, a Sunday afternoon in Clarksville, Stephanie founded Reclaim, an organization that reimagines the archives and uses them to discover and recover hidden, stolen, and lost narratives of Black people throughout the diaspora, and presents these findings through an artistic and thought-provoking lens. Next, Dr. Richard Reddick. Right there, in order. Dr. Richard Reddick is the incoming Senior Vice Provost. No, this is his second year. 1 year. Senior Vice Provost for Curriculum and Enrollment and Dean of Undergraduate Studies at UT Austin. Prior, he was the inaugural Associate Dean for Equity and Professor in the College of Education. Dr. Reddick is also a Longhorn, a proud Longhorn. And like my friend Rudy Mateer is somebody who, bleeds burnt orange through and through. Next we have, thank you, Virginia Cumberbatch. Virginia Cumberbatch. It's a proud LBJ graduate as well. As a storyteller, racial justice educator, and organizer, Virginia's work sits at the intersection of community advocacy and creative activism. With a heart to elevate the voices of people of color whose stories are often siloed or ignored, she co-birthed Rosa Rebellion, a production company for creative activism by and for women of color, creating space for the brilliance and thought leadership of women of color in media, policy, and community organizing. Beyond Rosa Rebellion, Virginia supports the development of a culture and ethos of equity for organizations as a racial justice educator and writer, working with brands like Bumble, Lululemon, the World Economic Forum, and more. Wow, that's great stuff. Okay, this is our final order. All right, this is our final panel for what's been really a very exciting Freedom Summit with so much artistry and creativity and great conversations. My first question really to all of you, and you're all creators in so many different ways and activists and policy experts, and this continues the last conversation. What can we do at this moment where, in so many ways, democracy and our ability to tell stories is really teetering on the brink? And that's not really being hyperbolic when we think about the passing of the anti-DEI legislation, and we think about really the suffocation of democratic discourse in our society right now in ways that we would have found unbelievable just a few years ago. And think of 2008, the election of Barack Obama. Think of 2012 and Michelle Obama, and 16 great speeches at the Democratic National Convention, things that we had never seen before in our lives. We would have never thought we'd be at this moment. What can we do? What are some, and I know what's cool about this panel is that everybody here is doing strategies for the question I'm asking. So I want you to really tell us what you're doing specifically in this arena to the best of your ability, especially now, and especially with storytelling that becomes something bigger than just the story.
Well, I think, the other panels have done sort of the incremental job of laying the groundwork around this, and so I love that we're ending this conversation around imagining a liberated future. I think we get caught up in just the work of dismantling and disrupting. It's like, well, when do we get to take space to dream and imagine what liberation actually looks like and feels like? And, I often start here. There's only two areas that we can live in, right? We're either part of dismantling systems of oppression or a part of maintaining them. There's no neutrality. And a lot of us are only comfortable in that neutrality, right? Where we're not necessarily disrupting or dismantling, right? That's even the conversation we're having around changing the language, right, of these conversations around justice and equity. We're not comfortable with the truth, and the truth is, right, that we come from a land that was founded not only on the backs of Black people, but on stolen land from Indigenous people. That is our birth, right? And so we have to face that head on. James Baldwin talks about, right, the only way to truth is to face it. And so I think we start there. I think that's the genius of the work of Fumi and Stephanie and so many of us that are writers, Dr. Joseph as well, and storytellers, is that we oftentimes want to start this conversation in June of 2023. Like, okay, cool. Well, this is what we need to do about the election, and this is what we need to do about this policy, right? Policies are birthed from lived experience, which are our stories. And if we're not telling those stories accurately, then what are we facing? What are we trying to address from a systemic level? And so, we just watched this documentary about Clarksville, and I talk about, we have to have an understanding of how our history is a part of our current reality, right? That those travesties are still informing our experience, right? We talk about it in past tense, like, oh yeah, that time where Black people were freed, and then we just politely ask them to move to the east of East Avenue, or what we call I-35 now. We are still grappling with that decision, right? The ways in which east of 35, right, we have schools that have lost its accreditation, but west of 35, 35, we have high-performing schools, right? East of 35, up until a few years ago when we had Dell Children's, we had a health care desert, right? Up until we had Whole Foods on 5th Street, we had a food desert, right? And so it's more, we oftentimes want to talk about policy, but policies don't mean much if we haven't shifted cultural paradigms or practices, right? The Civil Rights Act changed policy, but it didn't change how people were treated in schools. It didn't change who got loans. It didn't change who got access to education. And so I think part of this, is around our storytelling, because that's what informs or shifts our cultural paradigm, our cultural memory as a people. Because if we're not starting from the same truth, then I don't think we can move ahead. Dr. Joseph mentioned one of my favorite authors, Audre Lorde, and she talks about, right, I am not free while any other woman is unfree or any other person of color remains chained. And our liberation is tied up in one another, right? We don't get the Immigration Act of 1965 without the movement of Black people, right? We don't get the Disabilities Act without the movement of Black and brown people. And so part of this is having an understanding of how not our history as instructive about what it looks like to truly repair, right? Not just disrupt, but then start to do the work of repair.
Awesome. Thank you. That's awesome.
Wow. Co-sign everything Virginia said. It just struck me that this is a panel of Austinites, and I'm the kind of asterisk Austinite because I moved here as a 9th grader. Actually, Stephanie and I went to high school together. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is the fact that I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. I wanted to join the Air Force. That was my goal. But moving to Austin at the age of 14 turned me into an educational researcher and a scholar of inequity. Because you can't move here and learn about, my dad was in the Air Force, so I lived overseas. I come here and I had all the things about America that you learn, and it wasn't happening. It straight up was not happening in Go Valley or off of Berkman Drive. It wasn't happening in those communities. I'm like, what's going on? And so I think that was a very vivid example for me. And so when I think about that question, during the pandemic, I read a book called On Tyranny by Tim Snyder. If you've not read that book, I recommend you read it because it tells you how democracies fall apart, right? And it's not usually in a explosion. It's just these gradual things that happen, the normalization of othering of people and so forth that happens. And so I think what we've done today is really important, is just active engagement in democratic processes. Dr. Joseph, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy has been so active in encouraging democratic engagement, bringing people together, having dialogues, encouraging people to activate their voices. And something that Amber said earlier in the earlier panel I thought was really important is just this importance of centering on accuracy and truth, right? I just literally got off a plane yesterday from the UK with 21 students from the University of Texas who were incredible. And I was talking about the issue of the monoculture, some of us in this panel, I'm going to probably put Virginia, she's a little younger than us, but we can remember events that we all were participating in. Michael Jackson's Thriller dropping, you name it. All those things, we remember what happened. We were all there. There is no monoculture now. There's so many different ways to go. So the same is true for information and knowledge and news. So many different sources. How do you check sources? How do you know what's going on? So I think we have to really sort of commit to that. And everything we've been talking about today is based in reality. Nobody's been talking about their opinions on things or how they think about things. Folks have been discussing facts. Verifiable, objective data. It's out there, right? I also think the issue of organizing is important. And again, CSRD has been doing a great job of this. All of us in this room, the call has been made multiple times about the importance of us being in co-conspiratorial modes together, working together. And something Virginia mentioned, Audre Lorde and the ADA, so many of these things I think are important to realize. These are the works of black folks and black folks who had intersectional identities. So we occupy so many parts of identity, and we've worked in coalitions so effectively, and the coalition has to be broader. If anything, the last year has shown us, the last 3 years have shown us that coalition building is critical. We have to attend to it. We have to commit to it. We have to work through the hard stuff of working together, because sometimes working together is difficult and challenging. We have competing agendas. But the most important thing is that we commit to the work, we stay in the work, and we engage in the work, and we sustain it. When you say, what can we do? I wrote a book about DEI. Interestingly timed. It's coming out next month. But in the book, it's called Restorative Resistance in Higher Education, leading in an era of racial awakening and reckoning. I really talk optimistically about doing the work in DEI. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and we called it multiculturalism, right? And I know that I have felt very encouraged by the fact that as we've gone in this work, more and more people are seeing the value from different perspectives. It's not simply social justice. It's not simply, the way things should be. It's economic. And I'm good with all of those rationales. And so it really is stirring to understand that we've made incremental progress, but like most work that we do that's progress and moving towards equity and inclusion, there's always a massive resistance. It comes in so many different ways. And this way, it's kind of what we've seen before. So I think what we've talked about today has been very instructive as far as understanding we've seen this movie before. But the question is, do we have the resources, do we have the capacity, and do we have the willingness to sort of commit collectively to this work? It's very easy to say, well, if y'all get ahead, I'm gonna get behind, so I'm not gonna really be with you on this, versus saying, we're all catching this. And there's enough for all of us to be successful and move forward. So I really think it's our engagement in these spaces. And I love what Rudy said about the fact that, we need more people in these spaces, especially people who probably wouldn't be compelled to come to this event, but they need to be here because this is our democracy at work. And I just thought it was really interesting to think about the idea that there could be sort of a reaction to the increasing demographic realities in this country, in the state. And the reality is, the best way to sort of be ready for that is to be in the conversation versus sort of holding on and trying to maintain systems of oppression without realizing no matter what you do, over time, it's going to crumble. And it's better to be in that conversation about making things equitable and just and working together than to be on the receiving end or on the other side of things when it all falls apart. I'm just saying.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's real. And I feel like, Virginia, were you looking at my notes? Because I'm like, yes. I guess to add, I often quote my grandmother, Granny, and one thing she always said to me was, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so thinking about this question, I really view it through this lens of the work that I've done and am doing on, brown and black communities, and specifically starting with freedom communities. And thinking about how much we don't know, right? And I don't know if Miss Houston is still here, or Houston. Okay. I just want to give you your flowers. I mean, a lot of us didn't even know about the 1928 plan until when she was in office and said there needs to be a reckoning for this. So I just wanted to honor you. So in thinking about the freedom colonies, the first thing that I thought about was our relationship to enslavement, or the way this, the city, Austin, often does not talk about it, right? It's like coded language around homesteads and these different things. But thinking about, what the dream, what the the thought were for people purchasing this land. And, first of all, purchasing land that was considered untenable and undesirable. They weren't getting this premium land, right? They were getting land that was very difficult to do anything with. But like was quoted earlier, they made a way out of no way. So thinking about that, thinking about when schools were finally, the city of Austin finally provided a school, thinking about this school being, underfunded and overcrowded, thinking about the impact of the 1928 and 1929 plan and the, denial of services and resources, things like flood measures, thinking about all those things, and this is kind of forced displacement. And one of the reasons is around, these homes and these freedom colonies are falling apart, or this and that is happening because they couldn't get bank loans, because, they were limited to certain kind of labor or jobs, right? So thinking about that, and thinking about where we are right now, some of that might sound familiar because these are still things that we're dealing with, right? When I talk to, various folks in the different communities that I'm part of, the same things come up, and issues around food insecurities and food swamps, like in Colony Park, not having grocery stores and been fighting for that, forever, environmental racism. Certain homes, certain communities, or having homes built with dangerous and hazardous, lead and different things like that. Like thinking about all of those things, thinking about transportation, right? That was an issue. School closures, right? That's something that happened from the freedom communities. That's stuff that's happening now. So all these things are continuing to happen. And so, part of why I even did this is to try to understand what's happening right now. And this speaks to that. And so I would say always being led by the community that are most impacted and most vulnerable. Oftentimes what can happen, especially in these ivory towers, is we're telling folks what they need to do instead of letting them tell us what needs to be done, and then we get to work to kind of support them. So I think working with all of these different people that are already on the ground doing this work, and understanding that we need to bring all kind of folks into this. Like artists have always been the keepers of the truth. They need to be very much involved, and they can get the word out, and they can speak to these things in a way that can access and connect with people, in a very powerful way. So, yeah, that's what I'd say.
For my next question really dovetails into everything we've been talking about, but very clearly, I've been reading a lot about affirmative action. I've always studied affirmative action, but the histories of affirmative action for a new project I'm doing. And one of the things I can see with the evolution of affirmative action, especially post-Bakke, is that the original intent, and I want us to talk about this, there were really deep-seated moral and political commitments as affirmative action was initially articulated by activists from the grassroots like Stephanie has just talked about, right? And sometimes we had mobilizers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talk about it, Ella Baker, organizers talk about it. But the deep moral political commitments were about efforts at repair. And they were really, what's so interesting about the diversity, equity, inclusion, that evolves because of Justice Blackmun and the way in which he says, look, the only way I can justify this, and him and Thurgood Marshall had a big conversation about this, because he asked Thurgood Marshall, how long do you think, if we keep affirmative action as it is, would it need to be going on? And Thurgood Marshall basically was like, forever, like there's not a, because the harm has been so big, it's not a, and that really gave Justice Blackmun pause, and he, for his legal thinking and legal reasoning, he came to think of race as something that could be a factor, but shouldn't be the factor. And he says that diversity is a good thing. And his example in his legal reasoning is a working class white student from Nebraska or Omaha or Oklahoma would add diversity to the classroom, right? In that way, and a black student could too. So now that we're really heading towards the end of affirmative action, as we know it, in terms of with this court, probably, that's what the expectation. And it's been watered down over a number of different years. We had the Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had said when she sort of had a decision and reasoning that allowed it to remain, that she said, look, I don't expect this to be around in 25 years. I mean, she said it. She's saying, like, this is, there's going to be a point that this racism thing is fixed, okay? And so we don't need, stop your belly aching, which is the thing, right? So I want us to, what are the deep moral and political commitments that we need renewed in our own time, that Juneteenth has actually provided us a context to talk about? Because I think one of those commitments is finally a discussion about slavery. It's just about slavery. Harvard University has just published this brilliant report about their complicity in racial slavery. They're not the first. Georgetown has done it. Ruth Simmons is the GOAT. And Brown University, Ruth Simmons said yes when another president might have said no. Okay, so she's the GOAT when it comes to all this. And when we think about the Harvard report, it implicates Harvard in multiple ways. Harvard presumed to own human beings, but Harvard also took money from people who were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, right? And Harvard is being very transparent about this. Now, they're saying, well, there's a $100 million fund. We're going to do more with HBCUs. It might not be the repair that you think is right, but they're being transparent. And Tamiko Brown-Nagin and different historians were part of this process at Harvard, right? So that's really important. But the moral and political commitments, even from the 1960s, we've sort of turned our backs on it, even with the DEI talk. So one of the things as a historian that I'm seeing is that when we first talked about affirmative action, we talked about it, we combined policy, history, morality all together. Certainly Dr. King did this, but John F. Kennedy says the same thing, June 11th, 1963. He says the issue of systemic racism, it's as old as scripture and as clear as the Constitution. We need to have different new policies. So what are the moral and political commitments that we need? And I want you to specifically think about Juneteenth and this idea of black dignity and citizenship, because in many ways, DEI, which I support, we're still running away from those moral and political commitments of what does black equality look like in a country based on racial slavery? Does it look like, Stephanie, you've got a great crib at Martha's Vineyard and you host the Obamas? Is that the equality? Or does it look like something much different when it comes to mass incarceration and people who are in food deserts and people who are disabled and their kids have asthma, right? People who try to apply to this school and can't get to this school. What does equality look like? We asked those profound questions 60 years ago and even earlier, but I would argue from reading more about affirmative action that we stopped asking those questions once Justice Blackmun said, here are the narrow parameters that we can think about equity within.
Where to start?
Pack that.
Exactly. Easy question, 45 seconds or less. What trips me up is just like how profoundly short our memory is. Right? Okay, so I came to the LBJ School in 2014 and had the opportunity to help tell the stories of the precursors. Interviewed Colonel Holland and his wife Peggy Holland, tell the story of integration at UT. That was a year after Trayvon Martin was killed. It was during the time the uprising in Missouri and with Mike Brown. So simultaneous to me sitting at the feet of my elders to help tell a story of theirs that had not been told comprehensively.
Can you tell us the title so people can get the book?
It's called As We Saw It, The Story of Integration at the University of Texas. And this was it was published in 2018, which meant it took 60 years for the university to to comprehensively document this story, right? To pay homage, right, to these students who willingly or unwillingly were a part of disrupting this, the experience of being ostracized from this institution, the first public institution of the state of Texas to be integrated. So while I'm sitting at the feet of my elders, hearing these stories that, as someone who's born and raised in Austin, the daughter of a UT law grad, had never heard these stories. And I'm sort of confounded with the idea of navigating this space that was not built for me, right? And engaged in conversation in classrooms with my policy professors who were telling me that race is a segmented ideology connected to policy, which is confusing, right? And what I acknowledged during that time, right, was I could literally take the photos from the archives, right, that literally have photos in that book that says Austin is not progressive. It was a photo from 1952, and transplant that to a protest happening in 2015 or 2016. And so if I'm not even 2 full generations removed from the people who had to disrupt this space, these systems, right, to be acknowledged as full human beings and have the rights and liberties to pursue an education here. If I can sit in their company and we're still having the same conversation, I'm confused on how affirmative action has lived its lifespan. Right? And so part of the issue I think we are confronted with is, one, our lack of sustainability as a people, right? We are less than 3 years removed from the so-called racial reckoning of 2020. And yet I'm having conversations with companies and schools and institutions, and they're like, I thought we already did that work. I wrote that one check in 2020, right? I did that one march. We had that one workshop. Right, there was a study done last year of something like $500 million have been promised from all these massive companies to support racial justice across the country. Only 4% 2 years later had actually been dispersed, distributed. Right, so our lack of understanding, first of all, of just time, apparently, right? But also our lack of sustained effort, right? That this work of equity, this work of racial justice, we're talking about undoing 400 plus years of harm, 400 plus years of creating systems that were predicated on the understanding of who would be valued as human and who would not. So it's gonna take a little bit longer than 3 years, it's gonna take a little bit longer than 60 years, and it's gonna take a little bit more than just shifting policy. Like, this has to be, you know, we've been throwing around sort of a language shift from being like allies to co-conspirators. Rosa used the word co-agitator, because like I literally want people to be like an irritant in the spaces they're in, like to be agitators in the systems they're in. And that will require ceding power, that will require ceding privilege, that will require ceding position. And so many of us want to be in our spaces of comfort and convenience, right? If it's not a convenient narrative, then we don't want to tell it. If it would require us to be uncomfortable, that we might have to adjust our practices or our policies, hire differently, right? Or cede our position on boards, then all of a sudden we don't want to do it. And so I think this imagining of a new future requires, one, for us to have sustained investment in this work, to co-labor. You know, Stephanie talked about, you know, to work alongside the community. When I used to work at UT, and in our work here, I would talk about how like UT is an ivory tower, and the only way to shift from being an ivory tower to a community anchor is to no longer believe that the people with the 3 letters behind their names are the experts. We're experts because we have lived experience. We're experts because we've been doing this work for decades, and we've been watching our parents and our grandparents do this work with little to no resources. And so it requires that co-laboring, that collaboration in order for us to move to that space. And I think the last thing I would say about like what does it look like, and going back to the affirmative action question that you actually asked me, would be around, you know, this idea that this repair that we're talking about, this reconciliation, right? It requires us to take accountability for more than just good intentions. So many institutions and like we only want to take accountability when our impact can still mean harm, even with good intentions. And so I think, when we think about affirmative action, we're talking about it through this prism of, well, it's done what it's supposed to do, right? It's time to move on, right? Don't we have an equitable access? And we're like, if we're still talking about the ramifications of a city plan from 1928, how can we think that we've done the undoing of generations of harm? Someone mentioned the boots, lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. And I think about all the time that, I have colleagues or peers, and I say, like, your grandfather fought in World War II, and he came back and he got a free house, free education, right, and access to all these resources. Our grandfathers came back from World War II, and that was it. They came back, right? So we're talking about 3 generations of wealth and access. And so it's going to take more than just one policy to shift that. This has to be a cultural shift. And so I think my thought around specifically affirmative action, but I think we could, take that on a macro level, talking about housing, talking about education, talking about healthcare equity, is that there has to be a sustained presence around this. And it will require many of us, I think, to move out of our space of convenience and comfort to actually shift the way in which we build I don't even like to say democracy, to build a liberated future.
Some prophetic fire there from Virginia. So Peniel, you used the word morality, and I want to trouble that because we have a selective morality, right? We have institutions, and we have shibboleths, and we have utterances, we have faith systems that proclaim morality, but it's selective, right? Something like the right to bear arms is sacrosanct, that can't be touched. But something like the humanity of Black and Native American people, that's past tense. We don't worry about that. And one thing I really sort of think about, again, I just came from the UK, and there's an interesting conversation. I can't proclaim that it's a nationwide conversation, but the role that Britain has played in colonialism is really coming to the forefront. You go into the museums, there are displays, there's discussions about why do we have things we have, what's happening going forward. And, I think Virginia really nailed it. Like, this issue of intergenerational transfer of wealth, and that's a concept I didn't understand until I was in graduate school. But it is as simple as explaining to people and I actually recommend another book to people, which is The Dream Hoarders by Richard Reeves. And in that book, Reeves describes, class progression in this country, socioeconomic movement is quite difficult. And it's because of these things that are invisible or normalized. And we've essentialized these systemic failures by making them individual things. So that person is a bad person or a lazy person or a not hardworking person, versus there's actually systems in place that makes it impossible or very difficult for those people to succeed. And I think that's one of the profound pieces of misinformation in American history. And in fact, every year, at the beginning of the year, we have something called the Reading Roundup, which is conducted by my team in the undergraduate college. And we ask our faculty to read a book with incoming students. And I read the book on Juneteenth with students. It's a short book, first of all, so they'll read it. And it's a book by a Texan, Annette Gordon Reed, right? And it talks about Juneteenth, but it talks about so much more. And she has a quote that I always share with the students, which makes it very much about what we do here and what we do in this particular place. And it says, Texas is where I learned to think that people could and should try in whatever way they can to make life better for others alive today and for those to come. About the difficulties of Texas, love does not require taking an uncritical stance toward the object of one's affections. In truth, it often requires the opposite. We can't be of real service to the hopes that we have for places and people, ourselves included, without a clear-eyed assessment of their and our strengths and weaknesses. That often demands a willingness to be critical, sometimes deeply so. And back to the quote that Yaki had mentioned earlier from James Baldwin, it is because of the profound love that people of color, and particularly Black people, have had in this country, is that we keep on saying, wait, this is the idea. This was the concept, right? This is the moral underpinnings of this country. Do better, right? If you hadn't said this, we wouldn't be asking for it. right? And I think that's something that we have a real hard time grappling with. And that's part of that's the delay, really. When we start having that clear-eyed realization that there is a moral deficiency, there's a moral, Dr. King called it a check for insufficient funds. When we start really talking about that, and I'll also give credit to Craig Stephen Wilder for his book, Ebony and Ivory, who really exposed that the institutions that are so, I always tell people my favorite trivia question is the oldest corporation in the United States, the Harvard Corporation, 1636, right? So the oldest institutions in this country actively were built on slave labor or the profits from slave labor. And the removal and outright theft of land and property for Native Americans. That is a reality we have to come to deal with. And I think we can have we should have robust discussions about how we reckon with that. But we can't stop not talking about it. That was a really convoluted way to say what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm trying to say? We have to start, engaging that conversation. Here's the thing. Many of us have been talking about this for quite some time. It's time to listen, and it's time to hold people accountable. In that sense, I think it's possible to have a conservative mindset and actually have this conversation at the same time. They're not exclusive things, but again, selective morality is a problem here. If we're going to be truly moral, if we're going to follow these faith systems and these systems of government that claim to have moral grounding, it needs to be consistent, and we need to call people out when they're not being consistent.
No, I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think what I'd add is that this idea of freedom and liberation, we all have different definitions of that. And I think that, unfortunately, some folks have confused Black people's access to capitalism as meaning that we're free, meaning that we're liberated. And that's not the same, right? Yes, I have access to, things that my ancestors didn't. I can purchase certain things and I can do all this stuff, which, that's a whole nother conversation around how that can kind of take you off track. So that's the first thing I would say. And just thinking about, I think I have more questions than answers to this, right? Thinking about, for me, this frustration around how do we have these conversations when my lived experiences and those of people who are part of my community for generations have not been believed. How do we have these conversations of why even affirmative actions was necessary in the first place? Why when I want to get my house, assessment, appraisal on my house, I'm worried that I may need to take down all the pictures to show them that I'm Black because I'll have a different, outcome than somebody else, or worrying about when getting a house loan, and these are things that have come up, worrying about when I go to the doctor, especially as a Black woman, my pain not being believed, right? So all those kind of things that we navigate, not to mention, obviously, things around policing and so many things, right? That is a part of my everyday existence, and just as I was coming here, I was thinking about, my great-grandparents were enslaved, right? And on my mother's side, were enslaved in this city and surrounding areas. And that was not that long ago. My grandparents' grandparents, and thinking about that. And then my grandparents rearing my mother who reared me and all that trauma, right? And then you can go, we talk about enslavement, but then thinking about the period from Reconstruction on, right? That people are calling, the nadir, right? The second slavery, all these things that happened then when all of the land that was taken and all the horrible things that happened, continuing on to Jim Crow and into where we are today. All of those things, live in us. That trauma, that violence, and then feeling like you have to continue to try to convince people of your everyday reality it makes me, I'm woeful around how do I do that? How do I do that without recreating this violence for myself? So.
It's really good. It's really great. I want to, with the time we have left, do we have any questions? I want to get some audience. Any questions? Yeah. Jacob, can we?
What happened to the microphones?
There's one over there.
Take it off.
Do you want to swap here?
Or just take, we can share.
You can swap.
This one?
He's giving it to Jacob.
Let's keep the podium ones.
Okay.
I'll take these.
Okay, you got a mic. Right now.
This one?
It's muted too. Oh.
Okay, you're good.
Check, mic check, here we go. So, my question is, I know we're celebrating Juneteenth, and I'd like to hear, quickly how we reconcile and deal with the fact that slavery is not abolished, right? It's not abolished. And how are we living with that on a day-to-day basis? And the fact that there's a wonderful genealogist by the name of Antoinette Harrell, who actually is called the Slavery Detective, and she has done work where she goes into rural parts of Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera, and uncover the fact that there are African-descended people who were enslaved until the 60s, 1960s. And actually, if you go on Vice, there's an expose on her, and she's speaking to one of the men who was alive right now, who was enslaved on a plantation in the 1960s in Mississippi. Black person, okay? So that's always the question for me, is like, we can talk about these things in the past, but I'd love to know, how that viscerally exists in you, knowing that slavery still exists.
Well, very quickly, I think that this is where the work of Mariam Kaba and people who define themselves as abolitionists come in. And some people will argue that those folks who are living and working in prisons are also being enslaved, and they should have voting rights, and they should have dignity and humanity. And they died disproportionately during COVID, and Black people are 12% of the population, 38%, 36% of those who are incarcerated. I think the biggest thing is what we're talking about here in this panel. I think this idea of imagining and how do we define abolition, right? And Du Bois called it abolition democracy. I think Angela Davis has defined it really in the way that I started this. We started tonight, or this afternoon, freedom beyond emancipation. Toni Morrison defines it in very specific ways, not just in Beloved, but in Sula and Song of Solomon. It's an abolition of both systems of punishment that we've gotten used to, like Virginia was saying, but it's also an imagining of what comes after. And that's where Toni Morrison is so great, because she gives you the what comes after. And the what comes after, sometimes people don't know what to do with it, because a lot of times Toni Morrison finds the sublime in the quotidian, the everyday, right? And by the time she won the Pulitzer, there's a great interview online with Toni Morrison, and the 60 Minutes, it could be Ed Bradley, could be somebody else, especially as a Gen Xer. Remember Ed Bradley? He was the only Black man on television growing up, Ed Bradley. He was the only one you could find, right? You're like, we exist. Ed Bradley is on Sunday night. We were very excited. Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. That's my childhood. But there's one time, there's another, it's Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose is asking Toni Morrison, why aren't there any white people in your books? And she's saying, look, that doesn't define me and our experience. We know that all that happened, but I'm interested in what do Black people do in the aftermath and right? And so that's one viewpoint of abolition. So I think what you're talking about really profound, but it's how do we think about abolition, this idea of abolition in a way that doesn't frighten people. Because when you say abolish anything, whether people are saying police or punishment or prisons, it frightens Americans because so many people, we've defined those things as instruments that protect us against Black people, that protect us against queer people, that indigenous, Hispanic, so many different people, at times Jewish, Muslims. We define it as that. We have to, and I agree with Virginia in terms of a new cultural framework would allow us to not define it as so. And it also, a new cultural framework would allow us to not think of your success as diminishing me. What would, I live in Hyde Park. If 50 Black people moved into Hyde Park, I think it would cause a revolution. Just 50 Black neighbors, 50. Sure would. Hyde Park has thousands of people in it. But it's the racial segregation, because there used to be, in the same neighborhood I live in, there were, when Hyde Park was advertised, they advertised it as an all-white neighborhood. And when you see the advertisements, they're psyched about that. They're just like, there's no Black people gonna be here. And it's almost like we're supposed to be jumping for joy. And I'm like, I'm gonna grab it and say, yeah, let's go to this neighborhood. And that's like our history, right? So I think abolition is the key there.
What's interesting about that, Peniel, is that the document that's the framework for all of the anti-DEI legislation from the Manhattan Institute is titled Abolish DEI. Wow. Abolition can happen when you're interested in it. Just saying.
Wow. I did not know that. Wow is what my reply is. We had a question right here.
Yes.
No, we have a question right here.
Okay, that's fine. But this Black person was waiting here much longer than her.
I think she was the first person to raise her hand. But who's that? I think she did. She did? Okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
When we talk about abolishing, or not even using that word, abolishing, when we talk about Juneteenth, when we talk about freedom, justice, and so forth, it's so important that you have Black people who are formerly incarcerated on that panel. It's particularly going to say it's none of us. Particularly going to say it's either all of us or none of us. Include Black people who are formerly incarcerated in that narrative. Quite often when we have these panels involving UT and you're talking about dismantling systems, quite often you don't have Black people from the community who are rooted and grounded, boots on the ground, boots on the ground, sitting on these panels. I mean, quite often you have like academics, people with degrees, and that's wonderful and everything, but don't forget there's street people who also, people from the streets, people from the community, who help push this conversation further. Okay, I'm not through because, we can go into like dismantling colorism, interracism, and thinking white is right and Eurocentric standards of beauty. And I think some of y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about who's dating who's marrying who has children with who, but we could talk about those uncomfortable conversations about talking Black and sleeping. We can have that conversation too. But let's bring it back to the formerly incarcerated. You cannot tell me about justice and fail to include them. Fail to include someone who's formerly incarcerated at the table, having a conversation about dismantling systems. Also, if you're gonna tell me about outreach, go to communities. Go into those communities, reach those Black people out there. The challenge that I have for you is I want you to sponsor a Black person's bail, sponsor a Black person's trial, get them an attorney. We have a criminal and civil rights attorney right here, Malcolm Greenstein. But also, there's Black attorneys out there that you can also reach out to. Bobby Taylor, a bunch of Black attorneys. And
okay,
also include
I'm going to stop right there because we're at time, but thank you for your comments, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Well, address it. I also wanted to address, too. I want to hear some input from the panel. You want to be uncomfortable, so we're asking you to dismantle and be uncomfortable.
Do you want to?
I think you're absolutely right. I think part of what Stephanie and I were talking about earlier, that is, we're gathered here at UT, right? We're at the LBJ School that's somewhat in proximity to I-35, but oftentimes it is this, the dynamic we've created is the community can come to us and the community, oh, not us, I don't work here, but the community can come to UT, right, and be taught, right, be encouraged. But instead, what is the reallocation of resources to invest in the work of people who've already been doing the labor? And unapologetically, we just launched a fund where we literally just want to write checks to women of color who are doing abolitionist work in criminal justice, who are doing abolitionist work around health inequities, because we create these dynamics, as you were saying, where those voices aren't even in the room, right? We're talking about them without input, without understanding. But instead of having to have our logo on doors, having our logo on the event, what does it look like to, as you said, sponsor a bail, or to really just trust the community to do the work? You know, we're often asking, jump through 12 hoops to apply for this grant, which is a full-time job, right? And it has to be done in the language that we have deemed fit for these funds. Oh, and then by the way, when you get the funds, you have to do all these metrics so that it fits really beautifully in our annual report. That's not the work of abolition. That's not the work of repair. That's control. It's controlling how you get to be about your own freedom. And so completely, you know, I've seen your work up close and from afar, and I think that is truth that needs to be made, even those of us who sit in positions on these panels, uncomfortable about even the way we're doing the work of repair. So thank you.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I guess I'll just also echo, I agree with what you're saying. I will say, well, that may not be helpful. I was going to say maybe get to know some of us, because I hear you, you know, but yeah, and what was said earlier was about, I'm led by what the community has done. I'm trying to amplify the work that's been done for a really long time. And we do all need to be checked on that. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and your point about, you know, folks who have been, you know, in the criminal justice system, they do need to come to the table more, and they need to be present, and their stories need to be told, and they need to speak. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'll conclude by saying certainly the center, we've had folks who are formerly incarcerated on panels. We've done so much to leverage and amplify. And even though those of us here might be activists and scholars, we're also in the community. I know I'm in the community, but at the same time, I'm not trying to get into a debate over authenticity and what we all do. But I appreciate the comments, absolutely. You know, this is a great way to end our panel. Thank you so much to all of you. I think this has been extraordinary Freedom Summit in terms of Juneteenth. We're going to have a reception outside in Bass, so I hope everybody, not outside literally, it's going to be outside. I hope people stay so you can congregate, you can network. The one thing I'd like to leave us all with in terms of the a call, and a lot of times people say, you know, what is our charge and what should we leave this gathering with, is really a call for all of us to be more engaged in the work, because we are at a very, very precipitous time in our history. When I say post-consensus, I don't mean that in a way to be politically correct. I'm saying we have lost the racial justice consensus that argued that Black dignity and citizenship should be the beating heart of American democracy, and we've lost that to all of our detriment, including, and in certain ways, especially the University of Texas at Austin right now, and the city of Austin, the state of Texas. So when I say that post-consensus, I think that we have the opportunity to build a new consensus together, and that consensus should be both a moral and political consensus, but not a cheap morality of people not walking the talk, but a real, when we think about morality, of thinking about our children, thinking about justice, thinking about equality and equity for all. And again, even when we disagree with each other, refusing to scapegoat each other just because we disagree. Refusing to scapegoat anyone who's part of any political organization, as long as I think they have respect for humanity and human lives and believe in this idea of multiracial democracy. I'm with anybody who's interested in small d democracy for everybody. Right? And I think that when we think about Juneteenth, this idea of freedom beyond emancipation, I hope we leave this summit energized and really prepared to be inspired and to continue to do the work. And the work of Juneteenth is really the work of citizenship, dignity, democracy for all people. Thank you.